Residential Report Writing and Case Studies, Chapter 3, Appraisal Report, Page 1, Chapter Overview. In Chapter 3, we will cover the minimum content requirements of USPAP Standards Rule 2-2A for an appraisal report. We will address ancillary issues, including the use of pre-printed report forms, market value definitions, exposure time, disclosure of real property appraisal assistance, and disclosure of prior services. Chapter 3, Learning Objectives. Upon completion of this chapter, participants will be able to identify the minimum content requirements for an appraisal report. Identify areas where commonly used form reports may not provide sufficient information to comply with USPAP requirements. Outline USPAP requirements for disclosure of prior services provided regarding the subject property. End of page. Page 2, Introduction. Of the two written report options in USPAP, the more commonly used is the appraisal report, which is found in the left column of the table in Advisory Opinion 38, which is a previous chapter, and in USPAP Standards Rule 2-2A. The restricted appraisal report typically provides so little information and detail that it is not sufficient for our clients in most situations. In fact, until recently, the restricted appraisal report was never to be provided when there were intended users other than the client, hence the name restricted. However, recent revisions in USPAP now permit other intended users. However, each additional intended user beyond the client must be identified by name as an intended user in the report. That's highlighted. Because of its limited content requirements, its applicability in real-life appraisal practice is limited indeed. Your client will often request that your report be communicated at the level of an appraisal report. When your client requests that your report be presented on a Fannie Mae form, such as the URAR or 2055, he or she and Fannie Mae is essentially asking for an appraisal report. Keep in mind that you may never use a restricted appraisal report in Fannie Mae if Fannie Mae is an intended user of the appraisal report. Forms by themselves are not reports. A form like the Fannie Mae 1004 can be a suitable container for a report. In order for any Fannie Mae form to contain an appraisal report, we have to make sure that we fill it up properly by including the USPAP minimum content requirements specified in SR 2-2A. Note, the Uniform Residential Appraisal Report, URAR 1004 form, was last revised in 2005. There have been many revisions in USPAP since 2005. So the URAR appraisal report form no longer complies with USPAP without the appraiser augmenting the form. That's highlighted somewhat to include the missing USPAP requirements. When you use that or any other appraisal report form, you must be sure that all of the USPAP requirements are met. If the form does not provide for that, you must include the missing requirements in addenda or exhibits. End of page. Page 3, appraisal report. Since the appraisal report is the reporting option that is suitable for our clients and other intended users most of the time, this chapter will concentrate on this reporting option. Let us examine each of the 12 requirements of Standards Rule 2-2A in order. As before, the blue italicized, I think that's what that word is, italicized sections are direct quotations from USPAP. Remember that Standards Rule 2-2 states that the report must prominently state, that's highlighted, which reporting option is used. USPAP also states that to the extent that it is possible and appropriate, an oral appraisal report must meet the content requirements of an appraisal report. Before we dive into Standards Rule 2-2A, there will be a short quiz. End of page. Page 4, check your understanding. This quiz has a total of 3 questions. There will be 1 question per page. You must achieve 66% to pass this quiz. Let's start the quiz. Number 1. What is the USPAP requirement for disclosing the report option used in a written report? A. The client knows what report option is used, so disclosure is not necessary. B. Prominently state which option is used. C. This statement must appear in the certification. Or D. Use all capital letters. I'm going to go with B. Number 2. In real-life appraisal practice, which written report option is most commonly used? A. Appraisal report. B. Self-contained. C. Complete. Or D. Restricted use. I'm going to go A. Appraisal report. Number 3. Barb is reporting an appraisal of a single-family home using a URAR form. What is the best way to ensure that her report meets the requirements for an appraisal report? A. Meet the minimum content requirements set forth in USPAP. B. Fill out the form carefully and completely. C. Insert a disclaimer stating that she is limited by the available space on the form. Or D, insert a competency statement. I'm going to go A. Assessment completed. Finish. You passed. You got 100%. So remember, number 1, what is the USPAP requirement for disclosing the report option used in a written report? You said, prominently state which option is used, and that is correct. Number 2, in real life appraisal practice, which written report option is most commonly used? You said appraisal report, and that was correct. And lastly, number 3, Barb is reporting an appraisal of a single family home using a URAR form. What is the best way to ensure that her report meets the requirements for an appraisal report? You said, meet the minimum content requirements set forth in USPAP, and that was correct. Continue. Page 5, Standards Rule 2-2A. Standards Rule 2-2A states, A, the content of an appraisal report must be appropriate for the intended use of the appraisal and, at a minimum, I, state the identity of the client, or if the client requested anonymity, state that the identity is withheld at the client's request, but is retained in the appraiser's work file. Comment: because the client is an intended user, they must be identified in the report as such. However, if the client has requested anonymity, the appraiser must use care when identifying the client to avoid violations of the confidentiality section of the ethics rule. We must identify our client in the report unless they have requested anonymity. We generally know who the client is because this is the person or party who engaged us in the appraisal assignment. In the event that the client does not want to be identified in the appraisal report, you may comply with the client's request. However, if you omit the client's identity from the appraisal report that's highlighted, you must identify your client in your work file that's highlighted. It is also possible that the party who engages the appraiser might not actually be the client. Instead, this party may be acting as an agent that's highlighted for the client. USPAP states that an appraiser may be engaged directly by a client or through an agent. Many appraisal management companies, AMCs, consider themselves to be agents for their lender/clients. These AMCs engage the appraiser on behalf of the real client, and most AMCs do not want to be identified in the appraisal report as the client, even though they actually engaged the appraiser. In these situations, An appraiser needs to clearly communicate with the party who engages him or her to determine if they are the client or if they are acting as an agent for the client. It is acceptable for an appraiser to put the lender's name on the report as the client, even though the appraiser was engaged by an AMC, as long as the AMC is acting as an agent for the lender. Note, there may also be individual state regulations that define who the client is. End of page.